Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the Fast Friday edition of the show for November 18th, 2022. And today I want to shift gears a bit from the history lessons I've been doing lately on the show and focus on some really important nullification legislation, some strategy, and especially a call to action that I think we all need to take. On this episode, I'm going to highlight a piece of legislation that we are very supportive of, that we originally crafted some years ago, called the Defend the Guard Act. It's something that my friend Scott Horton recently called, check this out, one of the most important and exciting things happening in American politics today. So I'm going to do a quick overview of the legislation. I've got a little bit from James Madison to support the constitutional case. And then stay tuned to the end. I've got some action steps that you can take to support the Constitution and resist the empire at the end of this episode that you can take in your state today. But first of all, before getting to that, a quick hello, a huge thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one, I can't thank you enough. But since it's Fast Friday, I promise to not take up too much of your time. Let's see if I can get this info out to you in the next 10 to 15 minutes. I want to start out with a quick overview, an article we published by Mike Maharia recently, and he puts it this way: Defend the Guard is a state-level bill that would prohibit the deployment of state guard troops in active duty combat unless Congress follows the Constitution. You can't take the guard troops away from the states where they belong, protecting and defending in the states, and send them overseas to do whatever, unless they follow the Constitution. That is, passing a declaration of war or taking an official action pursuant to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 of the Constitution, which explicitly is there to call forth the Guard for one of three enumerated purposes. 1, execute laws of the Union. 2, suppress insurrections. Or 3, repel invasions. Now, there hasn't been a constitutional declaration of war in a long time. And this is totally destroying the founders' structure for the Constitution, for war powers in general. And here's James Madison talking about this. He said, in no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be... Think about this. This is coming from the so-called father of the Constitution, the guy who did so much to help craft and get past the Constitution for the United States. And he said, there's no part of the Constitution where there can be found more wisdom than in the clause which confides the question of war or peace to the legislature and not to the executive department. For the founding generation, to James Madison, to the old revolutionaries, it was so essential to ensure that the executive, which they saw as the branch most prone and interested in war, prone to war and interested in it, to be out of the decision-making of whether or not the country would be at a state of war or state of peace. And for Madison and for the founders, that had to be in the representatives of the people in the legislature. And they keep just passing the buck. They pass something and they say, well, we'll let the executive branch make the decision of when, where, who there's going to be a conflict with. They don't call it a war. They do all kinds of things to get away with basically abdicating their responsibility. But it's so essential to get back to this proper constitutional understanding. Madison himself said this is the wisest part of the Constitution. And here's why. He said the separation of the power of declaring war from that of conducting it is wisely contrived to exclude the danger of it being declared for the sake of it being conducted. So they understood, students of history, Madison and other students of history, recognized that if you gave a person the power to decide whether or not there would be war or peace, and that was the same person that would wage the war, you'd be likely end up with someone who would wage the war just for the sake of doing it, declare the war just for the sake of waging it. And here he goes further. The Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrates. Again, student of history, the history of all governments, that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. It has accordingly, with studied care, vested the question of war in the legislature. Now, I covered this in much more detail in an episode at the beginning of this year, in February of 2022, War Powers and the Constitution. an overview. It's like 35-ish minutes, so it's a much longer one. But here's the TL, I guess, DW. Too long, didn't watch. Only the representatives of the people have been delegated the power in the Constitution to change the state of things from peace to war. Now, if someone else attacks, that decision's already been made. Or if someone else declares war, that decision has already been made. Kind of like the Barbary Pirates. They not only attacked, but they declared war. They officially declared war on the United States first. So Thomas Jefferson, and even in that situation, responded in very limited ways. But I will link to that. And I should mention that all the things that I'm talking about here, the other articles in this episode here and source documents, original source documents, I will include those in a show notes section. I publish a blog post for every episode about 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is done. And you can find all of those over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And I should also quickly point out that congressional resolutions or acts that basically pass the buck, they say, well, the executive can make this decision of whether or not we're going to have a military conflict with this group or this country, or they can do it for a certain amount of time and just need to report back to us. These are all constitutional violations. This includes the War Powers Resolution or the War Powers Act of 1973 and pretty much every AUMF authorization to use military force and the like. Now, here's how James Madison put it once again. The executive has no right in any case to decide the question whether there is or is not cause for declaring war. And again, in the constitutional sense, the declaration of war is basically changing the state of things from peace to war. So it is not up to the executive. And if it's going to be a debate between some political expert today and James Madison, this isn't even a debate. I'm going with James Madison every single time, hands down. Now, the strategy for Defend the Guard is really based on James Madison's blueprint for how to defeat federal programs, how to defeat the federal government without relying on the federal government to limit its own power. And this comes straight out of Federalist 46. Those of you who've regularly watched or listened to the show for any amount of time, you've heard me cite this over and over and over and over and over again. And Madison said that states and individuals should perhaps use a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. And he said if a single state would do this, it would create some serious impediments for the feds. And if a bunch of adjoining states did this, it would create an environment the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. In other words, it's going to bring those federal acts to an end. Here, Daniel Webster, he called on states to put Madison, this is from Mike Meharry's article, to put Madison's Federalist 46 strategy into practice during the War of 1812. He said, quote, "The operation of measures thus unconstitutional and illegal ought to be prevented by a resort to other measures which are both constitutional and legal. It will be the solemn duty of the state governments to protect their own authority over their own militia. It's a duty of the states to stand in and interpose." I mean, we heard Madison say this in 1798. The states are duty-bound to interpose, to do something to get between the federal government violating the Constitution and violating liberty and the people of the several states. It's their duty. And here's Webster again, and to interpose between their citizens and arbitrary power. We know that arbitrary power is a power without limit. It's a government that basically can change the rules on a whim. It doesn't matter what you've put on paper, they're just going to change it around. We know that power is always going to do that kind of thing, but arbitrary power was specifically listed as one of the grievances in the Declaration of Independence. So it's the duty of the states to interpose between their citizens and arbitrary power. These are among the objects for which the state governments exist. So in essence, if they're not going to stand up against an unconstitutional war power, something that James Madison thought was the wisest part of the Constitution, breaking that, then why are they even around? What's the point, I guess would be the question. That might be another episode. Now, Mike Meharry talks a little bit about the impact of this. So now we can't necessarily shut down the empire in one fell swoop, but instead of waiting on Congress to do the right thing and follow the Constitution, even though they've done the wrong thing for generations, for decades and decades and decades, or waiting on the executive branch to say no to an unconstitutional transfer of war powers from Congress to the president, something that both teams have done. They've just accepted that year in and year out. They've refused to reject that for generations. Instead of waiting on Congress or the executive branch to actually follow the Constitution when they refuse to do so, you can actually have some impact on this, on these policies, on the foreign policy, the unconstitutional, illegal, immoral, unjust empire of today by passing the Defend the Guard Act in the states. And Meharry puts it like this: Guard troops have played significant roles in all modern overseas conflicts, with well over 650,000 deployed since 2001. And I think that number is actually a little bit low at this point. It's old. Military.com reports that, quote, Guard and Reserve units, Guard and Reserve, not the same, made up about 45% of the total force sent to Iraq and Afghanistan, and received about 18.4% of the casualties. That's pretty significant. So chipping away every small step. If you followed my work, you've heard me cite Thomas Jefferson talking about how the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches, because it takes time to convince people to do what is even for their own good. The ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. This is actually far more than just a few inches. It's pretty significant. And of course, on our membership card, you see our, and all over our website, you see a Latin phrase, which is our motto, Concordia res parve crescant. It means small things grow great by concord. This was used by John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution, at the end of his famous Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania in 1767. He was urging people to take a small step, because when you take one step, you can build on it. So what can we build on once we get a bunch of these passed? I guess time will tell. So Mike goes on, he says, since none of these missions, none, were pursuant to a constitutional declaration of war or any of the three expressly delegated purposes in the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15, the Defend the Guard Act would have prohibited those deployments of Guard troops. It really takes a lot of courage to stand up for this, but it's really, really important. So I want to point that out. It's very straightforward stuff, unless you do a declaration of war, or if there's an actual, that's different. Without a declaration of war, they're not going overseas no matter what. We're just not going to release them. So we first created this act back in 2010. We actually modified legislation that we had seen introduced in Wisconsin, Oregon, maybe Washington State. It was not really awesome. It was primarily focused on basically some UN resolutions and things like that. But the crux of it that I thought was really interesting was that they were proposing to say, well, we're not going to let you use our Guard troops. So I'm like, man, there's got to be something that we can do with this, focusing on Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15, Clause 16, for example, and focus on the constitutional structure. And then we built that legislation 2009, 2010. I believe the first time it was introduced was by Representative Aaron Libby, former Representative Aaron Libby, in Maine in 2011. We saw it introduced by a number of other states, but we really did not have the finances or the grassroots support here at TAC to push it forward. So it kind of just languished, didn't do really well. Then in 2015, a great Pat McGeehan, Delegate Pat McGeehan in West Virginia, basically picked up the torch and just ran with it. Just a guy on his own, just pushed this basically with no support at all. And every single year he's kept pushing it and pushing it and pushing it, and has really started to build up. Because of Pat, a number of other grassroots groups have gotten on board, and he actually adopted and improved the legislation that we use. I'm not sure if he even got it from us originally, but somehow it got out there. Small things grow great by concord. We saw what he did with it. We improved ours based on some of the things that they did in West Virginia, and he was really the legislative champion for it. Now, since I believe 2019, this organization, BringOurTroopsHome.us, they've been the #1 on the ground grassroots organization moving to push this forward state by state by state. They're coordinating, they're organizing, not in every single state, but I believe it's possible that we could see a couple of dozen states introduce this year. And the more that introduce it, the more that you get attention, the more that people rally to the cause, the more that they want to learn about it, the more opposition you find the weaknesses and how they oppose it, and then you attack and you keep pushing back. But it's not something that's going to happen quickly. So here are a few steps that I think you should take today. All of us need to take this today. First, get the model legislation. I will link to it in the show notes, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. get the model legislation, and then email it to your state senator and state representative. Of course, in Nebraska, it's just state senator, but email it to your state senator and state representative, not the ones in Congress, not the ones in the empire. Email it to them, and whether you think they suck or not, be firm and polite. If you're rude, if you're a jerk, it's just not going to work. Be firm but polite and ask them to introduce the bill in your state as quickly as possible. And then on top of it, follow, support, and get involved with bringourtroopshome.us. I believe they also have defendtheguard.us. And that's for the boots on the ground activism. You need to make phone calls. Once you get it introduced in your state, you got to make some phone calls to committee members. They will probably be on top of sending out action alerts to get those passed. We're going to try to get involved in that. We're a little short-staffed on what we want to do and a little low on the finances on what we want to be able to do as far as the activism level, but hopefully we'll be able to push forward at least a few states on that. And I know I'm leaving out a lot of things, but those are the action steps. Number one, get the model legislation. Number two, email it to your state senator and state representative. 3, support and get involved with bringourtroopshome.us. And then rinse and repeat. Keep pushing and keep pushing and keep pushing. You can feel free to email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com, if you got questions or ideas of what needs to be done next. And I know I'm leaving out a lot of different questions that really could be answered, but this is Fast Friday. Questions on militia, the War Powers Act, the Dick Act of 1903. There's a Supreme Court case in 1990. I think it was Perpich versus DOD. But if you're really, really interested in some basically like FAQs, maybe we can build a handout for that over time, or I can do another episode. If you're interested, please let me know. Anyways, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. If you support what we're doing, don't forget to join us as a member today, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. It starts out at just $2 a month. We really appreciate your support. And of course, leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, sharing links to this, leaving comments, that will help trigger algorithms of the mainstream platforms and get this information out to more and more people. Again, I really appreciate you being here today. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something. I hope you take some steps in support of the Constitution. And I will see you next week here on the path to liberty.